Hello, and welcome to Class 1 of the Introduction to Metadata. I'm your instructor, Robin Fay. If you have a question for me, you can contact me in the class space. It's better to use my office or one of the other class spaces besides the discussion forum because I may not see it in the discussion forum or may not see it as quickly in the discussion forum. So use my office space if you have a question for me. I'll also share resources and other things as we go along too that are more supplemental or of interest. So a little bit about this class, if you've not taken a class with me before, work and knowledge are cumulative, so try to keep up as best you can. I know life happens, other things happen. So work is technically due at the end of class, but I do give deadlines, so I will for our assignments usually give a week or two to get the assignment completed. So you'll see when you start to log in, you'll see when the assignment is due. Go ahead and do your assignments as soon as you have time to do it, but you do have until the end of class to finish everything up. The reason why I do this is because the work is cumulative and we're sort of building on knowledge. This class, not so much as some of the other classes that I teach, but it is still a cumulative process. And so if you wait until the very last week, you'll have a lot to do and it may be a little bit harder to kind of catch up. Certainly if you fall behind or you need extra time, and especially if you need extra time, so if an assignment has closed out already, let's say you're week 3 and you still need to do week 1 work, just let me know and I'll go ahead and open it back up so you can complete things. I just do that to try to help everybody stay on track a little bit. So the date that I post as the date the assignment is due is when I would prefer for you to get it done, but I usually give you another week beyond that. This is a pass-fail class, 70% or greater for the certificate, that's it. Each week will involve a quiz or exercises, and I'm trying something new with this class where I'm giving you some ungraded practice work that you can do, and that's because this isn't really a MarcEdit class, but MarcEdit can be useful for doing some of this kind of work, so I provided some opportunity to do some practice work, and that should be complementary to anything that you've already done in the MarcEdit class. Again, work and knowledge are cumulative. Your part, read the readings that I post, watch our class lectures, participate in the weekly discussion. It is part of your grade, so one post, one answer, or one response to what someone else has posted. You can do more. Lots of people get very engaged in the forums and they are very active, but I'm really, in terms of the grading, it's just a pass-fail kind of thing, and it's just, did you make an effort to participate? The reason why I do that is because this is an opportunity to really engage in professional and scholarly discussion. And for many of us, I know it's been a few years since I've been out of school, that being able to kind of talk about these things and learn what other libraries are doing, what kind of things people may be working on in terms of projects is just incredibly interesting. And we are an international community in terms of these classes. So, it's a great opportunity to kind of see what others are doing really across the whole globe. So it's a fantastic opportunity to not only network with your colleagues, but also to have that really sort of scholarly and theoretical discussions that sometimes we don't have time to do in our day-to-day work because we're so focused on getting the work done. There will be exercises and quizzes each week. And then, like I said, this time I'm giving you some ungraded practice work. And we will have a sort of an open chat time, but it just really depends upon what the interest is in this class. And I will do a survey just quickly to see whether or not an open chat would be of interest, but certainly if you wanted to do the ungraded exercises and kind of talk about those, I'll be glad to answer any questions about them. So week 1, this week, we're going to really focus on the types of metadata, including structural, descriptive, and administrative metadata, including rights management. And then and your goal in this is to be able to identify the basic types of metadata. So by today's session, you should know the basic types of metadata. You should be able to look at scenarios or look at examples and kind of figure out what kind of metadata might be driving that situation. There will be the quiz and knowledge check, and there's one reading, but then there's also supplemental readings, and then there is an assignment. So you'll see that you have a choice of things to read. And the reason why I did that for week 1 is that sometimes it's a little bit, we get off to a kind of a slow start in terms of the discussion, and so having a topic to discuss, I think, is really useful. And then the other part of it is some of the things that choices for readings or things about, like, bias and things like that in terms of our metadata. And so they're very sort of interesting and engaging topics. And it's sort of part of metadata, but at the same time, it's not sort of part of metadata in terms of looking through the lens of like practical application as much. So tried to provide some sort of workflow kinds of things that may be of interest to people who are really more interested in that kind of discussion and looking at case studies, and then also sort of more of the sort of hot topics that are kind of fun to discuss too. So pick your article. You can read any of the articles that's listed there. You can read all the articles that's listed there, but just pick one to discuss in the forum. If you want to discuss more than one, that's fine, but I'm only looking for one. Week 2, we're going to work on really developing an understanding of the terminology, and probably the most important part of it will be the structure of XML. So we're going to really look at XML and talk about how it's used and really look at the structure of it. And so for those of you who've not done some web development or haven't worked with a markup language, this will be a really good foundation for you. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and in that one I'm going to be giving you an exercise. That's where I'll give you that first ungraded exercise. So you'll get an ungraded exercise for that one should you want to do it. And that's really a step-by-step kind of mark edit kind of thing. You do a little bit of work with mark edit, and then you convert your records into mark XML. So we'll do that. Again, readings, discussion, all that good stuff. Week 3 is where we're really going to look at the different kinds of metadata schemas and really break them down and look at each of them and kind of compare them. We will look a little bit at mark, probably look at some more mark and Dublin Core records throughout that too, but it's really going to be focused on the other part of it. Week 3 is going to be really heavy on Dublin Core, because week 4 is really where you're going to practice some basic Dublin Core description. And so there'll be an exercise for that, of course, readings, discussions, kind of supporting all of this. So that's the view of this particular class. You should come away with this class having a very good foundation in terms of the basics of metadata, in terms of the basic types of metadata. The other thing that I want you to have as a takeaway is really being able to understand how XML is written, because that is also going to be applicable to HTML and any other web languages that are out there. And when we're talking about XML, I'm going to really talk about sort of the practical part of it. And then week 3, of course, is really where we start looking at our metadata schemas and developing that knowledge. And then week 4 is going to be focused almost entirely on Dublin Core, so that you really have a good sense of how Dublin Core works, and then also how Dublin Core works with mark records. So that's the goal of this class. I hope that you come out of this class, and if you are doing a system migration in your future, that you'll have a good understanding of sort of where your gotchas may be with your system migrations a little bit, in terms of like how records move from one system to another, that you should have some sense of that after this class. If you're working on an institutional repository digital library, you should have a really good sense coming out of this class of sort of how that works between systems, how harvesting happens a little bit. We'll kind of touch on those topics, but it's really about that data level in terms of our records. So that's my goal for you. Week 1, you've got your class session, which we're doing right now. Weekly discussion. weekly, but jump in, pitch in, whatever, participate, whatever works for you. You'll have your weekly readings. Most of them are pretty short. There's a couple that's kind of old, but they're still good, so I'm going to go ahead and use those anyway. And then you'll have your knowledge check or quiz. It is self-scoring. I give you 2 attempts to go through it, and then there'll be some exercise components built into it. The first week, for this first week, it's very sort of quiz oriented with some scenarios, and then as we go forward, week 2, 3, and definitely 4 is going to be much more exercise based. So just diving in, I think we all realize that our world has changed in the last few years, and boy, it feels like it's changed a whole lot this year, right? But when you kind of step back for a moment and just kind of think about from a data standpoint and a technology standpoint, so letting everything else go, very analytical, just step back, maybe look at what you have around you. Are you watching, listening to this on your, maybe your phone, or are you watching, listening to this on, maybe you're playing it through your smart speaker, maybe you're watching it on your desktop or your laptop or your TV. All these different devices that we have that we just use and sometimes struggle with using because they can be very complicated, but all these devices that we have that we just sort of use in our day-to-day life. Of course, we are both wired and wireless, right? So there's places where we have to be wired in, places where we're wireless. So much more mobile technology. It just increases every day in terms of what we can do. You know, my very first digital camera ever so long ago, it shot at 2 megapixels resolution, or and that was good at that point, which it's so low now. I mean, and of course, all of that's driven by data and metadata, which is really what we're focused on in this class. But the other part that I want you to kind of think about as we're going through these next few weeks is thinking about how all of these changes in technology is driving what we're doing in terms of libraries, in terms of digital spaces, in terms of our websites, in terms of our ILSs, in terms of the digital archives we have. Think about that. So kind of keep that sort of on the back burner, kind of thinking about like how those changes are driving what we're doing, because that is one of the key things that is changing so much of what we're doing. We're going to touch just a little tiny bit on BibFrame, just a little tiny bit on RDF next week, but not much, because it's not that class. But we are being pushed and pulled to the future in terms of technology. So it's not only that we as consumers and users are using technology, it's sort of globally how we use technology and what that means for digital technology and what libraries and repositories and historical societies do. It's very user-centered and personalized, and that's something that I think we have been struggling with a little bit in libraries. And again, not that class, but we'll kind of think about those things as we go along, like how do all those things impact what we do with data? Of course, social and sharing, right? Just sharing and social all over the place. Very visual and image-based, lots of images, lots of video, and it's a different way of learning, and we're learning differently. The technology is different. I think we're really seeing that right now with how many students are doing online learning and kind of how some learners are doing so much better in that online environment and others are not, because it is a different way of doing things. So our world is really moving forward towards the semantic web, and the semantic web, it's like, wow, what happened to that? Well, it kind of happened, and we just we didn't have a party for it. So, we have moved forward, and we're not going to talk too much about sort of the changes, but just kind of think about like how things changed in terms of technology. And I'll share a really neat little video. It's kind of old, but it holds up pretty well in terms of explaining the change in technology from sort of Web 1 or the early days of the web to Web 2, or what we think of the social web, to where we are now, which is, some people would have called it Web 3, then it kind of changed the name to semantic web because it's about making sense of things, but it is a very personalized experience. And we kind of gave it a different term now, right? So rather than calling it the semantic web, it's just become the Internet of Things. All of these things and devices that are connected together, which, this is how we kind of live our life and how we work these days. So I've given you a couple of little things for the Internet of, a couple of little screenshots and images for the Internet of Things that I really do like a lot. I like this one a lot because it really talks about not only the connection of all of the different pieces, but also talks more about the data part of it, because data is really what is driving this whole thing. Of course, we have the we have the internet and the sort of infrastructure of the internet, but then we have the data that's driving everything. So we're not going to talk too much about this. We're just sort of setting the stage for sort of where we're going with all of this. This one is an older one. I've used it a few times for presentations, things like that. But what I really like about this graphic is I like this sense of we have contributed metadata, meaning we have metadata that is coming from everywhere. And it may be that as a library, over here in the library cultural institution sort of section, educational section, we are both getting and we're both getting that content and we're giving it out, right? We're putting it in our repositories, we're putting it on our website so that people can find it. And all of this is going through some sort of metadata process. So metadata is not just limited, and we look at XML next week, we're actually going to talk a little bit about mobile devices in this, but metadata is not just limited to what we do in libraries. So although this class is primarily focused on what we would do in libraries or archives or historical society, metadata is really out there everywhere. And it's being used by all different kinds of devices, and it's just truly everywhere. So like I said, this graphic is older now, but I just like this idea of being able to see images and documents and web pages and multimedia, and it all has metadata wrapped around it. We can't, of course, always see that. It depends upon, whether or not you can get into the back end or you can see that information, but that metadata is there. And then we have things like, our search tools, our discovery layers, our search box on our website, things that we share, LibGuides, all of those things that we may create, a finding aid, all of those kinds of things, that's them pulling those resources in or linking to those resources and creating more metadata around it. So libraries, of course, this was kind of us in the big picture. But, when we think about how we work and where our sort of communities of practice around us are, there are a lot of different communities of practice that exist both within our institutions, within our organizations, and in that larger environment. So, we're over here maybe in the library, or maybe we're over in the museums, or maybe we're even working in a scientific community doing something. But each of those have their own standards in their own ways of doing metadata, and sometimes their own practices. We do overlap sometimes. Obviously, we overlap quite a bit with the historical societies and the archives and the museums. Sometimes the archives, museums, historical societies are part of the library, and sometimes they are located elsewhere. Faculty communications, scholarly publications, sometimes those are collected and organized in a repository in a library, or sometimes they're housed in the faculty support office. So, there are communities of practice all around us. And Why is this really important? Well, the reason why it's important is when you start looking at metadata, it's really easy to just look at library metadata and kind of think about what we're doing. But there are communities out there that are using metadata in ways that we can either work with that metadata, maybe we want to share metadata with them. If you have a Center for Teaching and Learning, that is the place that uh, is the Scholarly Communications Office, and they hold all of the faculty papers. Maybe you want to put some of that into your uh, your digital library, or maybe you want to put some of that in your library catalog, or maybe you want to feature it on your website. So there's these opportunities that we have within these communities. Of course, there's also other kinds of data that we may want to use or share, things like assessment and statistics data. This is both internal measurement and assessment. So this would be like user surveys, vendor statistics, all that kind of stuff. We may want to use that in different ways. So, if you're looking at your e-resources and you're trying to make a decision like, oh, our budget's been cut, we really need to figure out, where are we going to make up that difference? You may be looking at your e-resources and really trying to figure out, what's used and does it overlap in the collection? Do we have a lot more e-resources on this topic? So, trying to do that analysis. So we have statistics that we use in terms of metadata, in terms of looking at how things are used, things like that. But mostly, for most of us in this class, we're really focused on what's the descriptive data arm of this. So this is really our bibliographic and archival data, and then other data describing the items we have for inventory control practices. So this is like barcodes, circulation records, item status, things like that. Of course, we also have then access mechanisms, which can also be a form of metadata, like our URLs, if it's a digital object, call numbers, even our websites are data. It's really just data, 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 data. The end goal in all of this data, at least for those of us in the library aspect, is to help our patrons find what they need, what they're looking for. And that is those FRBR, that functional requirements for bibliographic records, user task. So like 2013-ish, a little bit before that, there was a group that decided that it was time to revise the cataloging rules, which had been AACR2 for years. Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, second edition, had been for years. And they realized that we needed to revise those rules to better address digital content, and also to include more communities like museums and historical societies and archives and other other organizations and community groups that were either part of libraries but really weren't covered under those rules, or outside libraries, but the opportunity for partnerships. And as part of looking at revising those rules, they realized we needed to actually do a complete step back and really nail down what the philosophy was for our work. And this goes for metadata too. What is the philosophy? What is our purpose for doing metadata work? What is our purpose for cataloging? And our purpose is to help our patrons find what they need. And they actually defined 5 user tasks: find, identify, can't remember the other 2 right now, but anyway, goes down through the list to can they acquire it? Can they find it? And then most recently, they've added exploration or explore. Can they find other related resources? But it really is about helping our patrons find what they need. So from a larger metadata standpoint, we're looking at metadata the most broadly this week. Metadata should be able to support interoperability, meaning that that data and the software and hardware that we're using on different machines, maybe from different vendors even, but that we can share that data well, or we can share that data. So interoperable just means, can we share that data? Now, we all know that depending on what system you're working with, which vendor you're working with, could be even, with the licensing of those records or whatever may be, the ability to share records can be complete and transparent, and you can share everything and it's very easy to do, or it can be very hard to do, or you can only share parts of that information. That's sort of levels of interoperability. And of course, when we think about this larger landscape of, the semantic Internet of Things, the ability to share data across platforms, across devices, that is a crucial part of really how we think of metadata, that it needs to be able to do that. The other part of it, and modularity is one of those things where it's like when you see it, you'll know it, although you don't know it by that name perhaps, but it really just means standardized units or dimensions for flexibility and variety of use. So there's been talk in the last few years about how do we break our data down more, how do we put it into smaller bits that can be used in different ways and build things differently. So, rather than having one big chunk, we break it down into smaller pieces, and that means we can manipulate it better, we can do better searches, we can run better reports because things are more granular. So that's all modularity is. It's the construction of using standardized units. We usually think of standardized units, well, we don't sit around and think about standardized units most of the time, but if we were, we would see them as being records and those record fields. So those fields being those units within it. And we'll talk more about modularity as we go along. Extensibility, meaning that we can increase it in scope. So if you have your ILS, you could take records from it, you could put it into your institutional repository, and you could do more with them there, perhaps. But that's the idea of extensibility. It's scalable. You can extend the scope or range. And then transferability, which is one of the most important pieces for libraries, is the ability to move data from one system to another to make it portable. And so there's your system migration. There's your harvesting records, and we're going to talk more about what that word actually means in a second, but there's your ability to move records, to migrate records, to take them from one place to another. Or, rather than being able to transfer them, maybe you're looking at interoperability and you're just going to share that information. So interoperability, you're sharing data back and forth. It may mean that the data resides in one database, but it just gets shared other places. Or if it's actually moved someplace else, then that would be transferability. So as we're going along for the next few weeks, and especially as you get out into your work, if you are working with either MARC records or you're working with Dublin Core records, if you're working with anything in systems or the website, any part of that technology where you're working with the code or you're working with some sort of records, then working with vendors, think about that. So when you're looking at buying something from a new vendor, just think for a moment, like, how will this share data? Like, will we be able to get to these records? Will we be able to share this data? What kind of reports can I run? That would fall under that modularity. Like, what can we do with this information? Can we customize the search in a way? Can we search that field differently? That would be that aspect of modularity. Is it scalable? What happens if we want to do more with it? Can we embed images? Can we embed video? Those kinds of questions you may have, that would fall under extensibility, like what's the enhancement process for this? That would fall under extensibility. And then what happens if we need to, can we import records into this? Will you help us migrate our records in or out? What do we do if I need to get a copy? And if so, how? So these are questions that we sometimes don't really think about in terms of metadata, but really does get to the heart of metadata in terms of so much of what we do in libraries. Can we share the data? And how do we share the data? Is it broken down? Is the data broken down into fields, or is it broken down in ways to where I can manipulate it or customize it in ways that I might want to? Is it, can it scale up, and what does that look like? What happens if we need an enhancement? There's your extensibility. And then, how do we get records in? What if we want to put more things in there? How do we get records out? Transferability. Should we want to participate in the Digital Public Library of America, or maybe we want to participate, we're building a consortial project. How would we be able to transfer those records back and forth? So the how of it is pretty straightforward in terms of a high level. Once you get down to the granular, how do you do it between this system and this system, that can get more complicated quickly, but the sort of at the high level, that's what we call crosswalking. And this is something where there'll be different processes and mechanisms and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about processes in just a second. But basically, crosswalking just means that you are going to, it can be a database, it could be a website, but you're just going to create or edit metadata, work directly with the code, maybe not. Sometimes we use a work form. And that metadata that you put in there can be crosswalked, or meaning it can go from one to another, or it can be exported from one and imported to another. So crosswalking, when you think about what a crosswalk is, right, it's like a directional thing. It means you're going to go from one place to another, and you have guidance, right? You have those little things, you have the lines on the road, you have signals to tell you how to go, to when to go. So a crosswalk for data, it's an older term, but it really is just still a great term, that it really does talk about, getting the data from one place to another. An example of crosswalking is maybe you're creating a MARC record, and but your source that you're creating that MARC record from is starting from a non-MARC format. So you have some kind of form that asks for the title, asks for the author, kind of a book form, and then you take that and you create a MARC record out of it, and then you import that record into your ILS, your MARC-based catalog. Crosswalking depends upon all of the things we just talked about. It depends upon whether or not you can share data. It depends upon how the data is broken up into units, because that becomes very important when you're trying to go from one database to another. And then also how that data can be used in different ways from that original source. So how extensible it is, and of course that transferability part of it. So examples of crosswalking. So this is a little example I just pulled from the web, but I thought it was kind of a neat one. Really all the places that data can go. So you have a data publication repository for this university. So people upload things to the web, or they use the repository app, or there's electronic data capture process, or there's even some old data that's just been floating around for a long time that's in there. So, that's one batch of stuff that you have, and it has all those different ways to get information in there, to get that data in there. And then you have another database, and they're crosswalking back and forth between, or at least from one to the other. And then finally, you have the state library, a collection of public domain books, and they're going to put those also into the repository. So the same sort of thing, they're going to just crosswalk them over. The more common term you probably hear is harvesting and ingesting. So crosswalking to me is that mechanism for like how at that highest level, like, okay, I'm going to take these records and I'm going to crosswalk them over there. I'm going to figure out how to get them from one side of the street in this one building across the street to the other building, from one repository to the other. How am I going to crosswalk them, get them over there? And harvesting and ingesting is actually the mechanism for how that process happens. Sometimes they get used interchangeably, and I confess I sometimes do this where it's like, is this a harvest or an ingest? Harvesting is retrieving the data from another source. So this is an outward action. This is, if you have a repository, you are going out and retrieving data from somewhere else. So it's an outward action from where you're starting from. Ingesting, and I found these, I find these terms kind of funny because they're so food oriented. Ingesting is adding data from another source into a different database. So like, if I am database A and I want data from database B, I'm going to go out there to harvest it. So I go out to gather my records. Then once I gather them, I'm going to ingest them or bring them back into my database. So ingesting is an inward action. Harvesting is that action of gathering. So harvesting is gathering the records or the data, and you may or may not do anything else at that point. So if you're doing some kind of statistical analysis, or maybe you're doing your Google Analytics and you go out and you get the data about your website statistics, and then you're going to do a report, you've harvested data, but you haven't ingested it. If you take your Google Analytics web statistics and you go out and get your data from Google, Google gives it to you, so you go out and you get your data from Google, then you're going to import it into another database. That import into the other database would be the ingested. The other term that you'll hear when you're out in the community, out in the metadata community and the data community as a whole, is data mining and data harvesting. Data mining actually refers to the automated process of comparing data to find patterns and commonalities of group items. Now, at that point, when they are identified as groups, then at that point, those may be pulled together. So for example, when you're shopping online and it's like, and here's some other related things you may want to see. They're looking at what you have either purchased or read, and then they're looking at commonalities to find those patterns and to find those things that are related. And whether or not they actually end up being related, that's that metadata part of it and that artificial intelligence. We all know that computers can't quite think like humans yet, so sometimes you get really funny suggestions, but it is looking for some sort of pattern related to what you or whoever used the computer last did. Data harvesting then refers to the process of collecting data. So you remember, just like harvesting, in terms of how we think of it in terms of metadata, harvesting is retrieving data, going out gathering data. Data harvesting is that same process, but that's sort of the term they use in that larger data world. So data harvesting refers to a process that collects data. What we think of in terms of metadata, and we just call it harvesting, is the same thing. What we don't usually talk about is data mining, because what we're doing is typically a more manual sort of process. So if we had a system that we would put records into and it would analyze them and make some suggestions and then give us records back to look at, then that might be more of a data mining kind of process. We have been talking more about data mining. You see it more for electronic resources, and you see it a little bit more for like ILS kind of stuff, like discovery layers, like how do you make that relevance ranking better? So we have a little bit of discussion of data mining. Of course, we hear a lot about data mining in terms of like taking our personal data and like mashing it up, but it's the same sort of thing. It's taking all of our personal data, taking all of our shopping habits, and then looking for those patterns and commonalities to try to sell us something, right? So we hear a lot about data mining from that larger kind of web world. But, when we're looking at data and we're looking through, well, I would say we don't want to sell people anything, but we do actually kind of want to sell them something, right? We want to sell them a good experience so that they find what they need. We want to give them those Ferber user tasks, or not give them, we want to make sure they can achieve those user tasks, they can find what they're looking for. So it is similar to that experience. We're just not trying to make money off of people, but it is a little bit of a similar experience. But thinking about how we would crosswalk, harvest, and or ingest data, we really need to figure out, in order for us to make it make that happen? Like, how do we make metadata inoperable? Like, what do we do? And how do we make it modular so that it can be extensible and transferable? Because the smaller units you break something down, the more choices you have for how you reconnect them and repackage them, right? If you've ever done one of those puzzles that has like 5,000 pieces, you know that you'll find multiple pieces that are the same shape and can fit in the same size. Whereas if you have one of those puzzles, like a kid's puzzle that has like 5 pieces, there's no way you can put it together wrong, right? It just goes that one way. So the more we break data down, the more we break it down into pieces, the easier it is for us to sort of repurpose it or use it in different ways to benefit our users. But in order to do that, we really need a detailed plan, right? I mean, that's the way to do things. And that would be a schema. So a schema is one of those terms, you'll see it out on the web all over the place, and you'll see lots of different definitions of it, and it makes it sound way more complicated than it is, because a schema is really just a plan for data. The word schema in Latin means plan. That's it. It's a plan. That's all there is to it. Oh, we made it sound so hard, or maybe so complicated. But anyway, so a schema is a set of rules covering the elements and sometimes requirements for coding. It's not always the requirements for coding, but sometimes. But it is a set of rules or a plan. So that's it. It's a plan you're going to follow. So if you're one of those people who makes plans and you don't follow them, that is not a schema. A schema is a plan that you follow. It's like going to the grocery store, you buy everything on your list, exactly in the order that it's there. That would be kind of a form of a schema. For us, a schema addresses how the metadata will be set up and its standards. And that is like what information we're going to record and then how. And the Oxford Language Dictionary has a really nice definition of schema. So I wanted to give you a more formal one besides mine. A representation of a plan or theory in the form of an outline or model. And that model is the important piece of it for us. So if you write your grocery list in an outline and you're going to follow it, then you have a schema, according to the Oxford Language Dictionary. For us, examples of schema, and we're going to talk about a lot of these in week 3, double encode, TEI, EAD. These are kind of more archivy kinds of things. Mods deals with kind of a little bit of everything. MADS is authority data. VR Core is more visual things. We're going to talk a little bit about all of those in upcoming classes. So don't need to know those right now. We're really focusing on the terminology and sort of that introduction to metadata right now. So let's break down the terminology. So we're going to have a little bit of terminology and then we're going to look at examples. So schema is a plan, or from the metadata, from our definition of it, from the metadata world, schema is a set of rules defining the elements. So that's probably the most important piece when you look at a schema. It's going to define your elements. So what does it mean by defining elements? If you are using a specific schema like double and core, you will use the elements. You can think of them similar to a mark field. You can even call them fields if that's easier for you. You know, you're going to look at your element list and that's it. You can't make up anything else if it's not on that list. Now, you can, and we're going to look at examples of this later on, but you can combine 2 schemas into one record in some systems, but you have to define exactly what you're doing. So it's a little bit more work to do that, but we'll look at an example shortly. So your elements, those are similar to a mark field record, and they can be made up of different types of metadata, and this is defined by the schema. So the schema is your plan. It's going to define all of this. Having written, you know, a metadata, and we're going to look at examples of a couple of things I've written in just a little bit, but, you know, having done this, it's a lot of work to kind of go through the elements list and look at each element and figure out whether or not you're going to use it and how you're going to use it. based upon your schema. So your schema kind of gives you that outline, and then you have to fill in the outline. So your schema, that's your set of rules or your plan that you're going to use, and that is going to define the elements you're going to use, your elements or fields. So in Ferber, for those of you who are Ferber or have studied some Ferbers, that functional requirements of bibliographic records, also now known as the library reference model, or sort of larger library reference model, there's something called RES, which is at the top of everything, and RES is sort of this master level entity. So it's the, thing above all things, and it has attributes. Attributes being the characteristics, and those attributes are also the metadata elements. So when you start seeing the word attributes mentioned, that also corresponds to these metadata elements. These are things that you would want to capture when you're looking at it. And we can't go into that too much, but if you're not familiar with that, basically what you would just need to take away from this is that if you see the word attributes, that also means a characteristic, and that is something you would need to look at in terms of what element you're going to use or what field you're going to use in your metadata. More terminology. I promise we're getting close to the end of this. Definition is a brief description of the information contained in the element. I mean, that's kind of an easy one, right? It's just the definition of what kind of information is contained in the element. Function, and this is something that we don't talk as much about with metadata work as we should probably, is how the element is used. So we don't talk as much about what the function of the element is, but the function of it is very important once you get beyond descriptive metadata. So if you're working in Dublin Core or you're working in something else, maybe you're working with Primus, which is preservation metadata, you're working with other types of metadata where you're going to expand out into sort of different types of metadata. And we're going to talk about types versus schema in just a second. But if you're looking at different types of metadata, then thinking about what the function of that element is important. And we'll talk a little bit about function as we go along. Before I wander away, I want to talk a little bit about application profiles. So you have your schema. So your schema is your set of rules or your plan, right? So that's sort of your map to get started. Oh, don't want to use the word map. Anyway, that's what you're getting started with, your schema or your plan. And then you have your elements, which will be listed in that schema. But then there's something else out there called an application profile. And an application profile is, you can think of it like an instruction manual. And for the RDA toolkit, this will be a way to share best practices and guidelines for specific elements. So somebody will come in, they'll create an application profile, and they'll pull together everything in the RDA toolkit that supports a best practice. So maybe there'll be, we really haven't done a whole lot of this yet in the RDA toolkit, but it's something that they're just starting to do. But maybe we'll have a best practice for how to catalog DVDs, and there'll be an application profile that pulls, best practices for DVDs or audiovisual materials. An application profile consists of a set of metadata elements, so that comes from our schema, and then it includes, it can include other things like policies and guidelines for a particular application. So an application profile can be a way to define specific elements, and this is defined much more granularly than what would be in your schema, or policies for applying using a schema. So an application profile is really meant to be a sort of a group of instructions to help you along. I already mentioned it can serve as an instruction manual. It can also be used by systems to define user roles. Now, this doesn't happen in all systems, but some ILSs, some websites, they will use application profiles, and this will be a way to say, if this person is a student, they only see this much stuff, or these resources are available to them. So application profiles can be a way to kind of tailor that experience and show people the resources that they may need. So here's an example of a Dublin Core application profile. We're not going to go through all of this. I just kind of want to show you. You can look at it in a more sort of diagram way. You know, like you have usage guidelines, and then you have your profile here, and you have what the metadata vocabularies are. You know, you have all that kind of stuff. This would be a more visual layout of it, but a more practical view of an application profile is, if you look over here on the left, not the right side, because this is kind of two things in one. It's my master document. You have your element. So there's the element for creator. This is for Dublin Core. So element creator. It is required. So I've determined, you know, based upon looking at the Dublin Core schema, we are going to use the element creator. And I have determined that that will be required for any records going into our repository. There is a note explaining, so there's the description. You remember element has a description or can have a description. Not everything's going to be this robust, but so scope note, that's an old school term, scope note, but means what is the scope of this? How would you use it? Explaining what that is. Use creator for primary authors or other content creators. So there's how you use it. So this is an application profile in a more practical sense, where it's like you're going to take what's in this list. If you're adding metadata to my repository, you're going to take what's in this list. Anything that says required is a required field on the form. It won't let you skip past it. So kind of probably didn't need to put required there, but then I've given the information about what it is, and then also instructions for how to record that. And then, you know, further down, there's some examples and how to map it to a mark field, and we'll talk about mappings later. But really, what I want you to look at is the left side. So there's the element name, creator. This is coming from Dublin Core. I've given a term if it's going to map to a mark, so that one's kind of not part of an application profile, but element, there's our element use. That's telling you how would you apply this, when would you apply this, that note explaining what that field is, and then finally the most important part of it is probably the instructions. So those instructions serve as that application profile. And actually, we ended up using two different schemas in this, so those are defined down at the bottom to kind of explain that. Here's another example. This is from LC and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. So same sort of thing. Toolkit label, okay? Toolkit label that's coming from the RDA toolkit. Copyright date, and we have that it is applicable for monographs. So you can see down here they have a code that tells you what the situational requirements are, as they call it. And then, you know, whether or not you need to use it and all that kind of stuff. And then they have the same sort of thing where they're mapping it over to MARC. So this is a really interesting one that I pulled off some LC materials for the RDA toolkit, but it does show an application profile in action, sort of. So this can look kind of like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. I don't quite get it. But this actually seems like something we would use, something that we would give people. So this is actually a Google spreadsheet, but it could be something that's built into the software. So that if you went there and you looked at the software, there would be links to all different kinds of things and showing you things. The RDA toolkit, this probably will be an application profile that's built within the RDA toolkit at some point, or at least for LC. So that's a little bit about how application profiles work. So we won't talk too much about application profiles because we're not really going to be building them, but if you are looking to train other people to do metadata, if you are looking to create some sort of instructional documents, or you're looking to sort of standardize what you're doing, coming up with something like this or this is going to be very helpful, because not only will it define and you'll clarify what you want each element to be, but then you have something you can use as a standard going forward. So we talked about application profiles. That's kind of a way to create instructions and not only create instructions, but kind of be able to share those instructions. We talked about schema as being your plan or set of rules. And then we've talked about, different parts of the metadata. So how do we actually create the metadata? Like how does that happen? And this is a basic Dublin Core record. But we typically use a markup language. And a markup language is a computer language to format metadata or format data. So that's all a markup. So markup just means it is going to, these little kind of triangles, they're actually called angles, but those little brackets or triangles there on the side, that's that's what a markup language, sort of a feature of a markup language. For those of you who have done web development or something else where you've used another markup language, you're going to look at Dublin Core and go like, oh, it looks like something else, because it does. They share that similarity in terms of the formatting because of it being a markup language. But typically we use a markup language, and then we follow those schema. So we follow our plan requirements to create those records. Now, we don't always write in code, so please do not worry that you're going to have to, be a supreme master coder, because you're not going to have to do that. But knowing the code and being able to understand it is incredibly useful, especially when you have to troubleshoot things. So we will look at code. We're going to talk about resources to create records that's not code-based, but we are going to be looking at code as we go along. So we kind of have a sense of like where we are, and sort of, we create descriptive metadata because we describe the items in our resources, in our resource collections, right? But what about the data that we create, or data that goes beyond what we create? What about all those devices, all the devices we have, our computers, the networks? What about the data created by the device itself on the resource? What about the scanner that creates data? What about all of those things? Well, all the computers and softwares that we use do create some kind of data. And they add information to our records, or in some cases, they start the record. So if you take a photo on your digital camera or on your phone, that there is a record that's actually generated. And actually, if you have specific software, you can open a JPEG or you can open an image file and you can actually see the code of it. And we're going to actually look at a little snippet where you can see some of the code of it, but it is all coded information. So although we see an image, that's because the software knows to display a JPEG in a certain way as an image to us. Same thing with digital video. It's not actually images, it's actually that digital coding on the backside of it. We see it as images because that's how it's presented by the software. So sometimes when you have a video that won't play and you hear it's like, oh, it's because you're missing a codex, that is just sort of that little translation piece to be able to understand what that video format is. Typically, this kind of data that's created by our devices and computers and things like that, typically we cannot add or edit to this data. There are ways to be able to do that, but typically we don't. And it often falls outside of our metadata schemas in terms of our elements. So it's not something that we necessarily see. So what is that data? Like, what is that data that's out there? Well, there are three basic types of metadata, and this is how we get to being more modular, because for one, we break down the types of metadata. There's descriptive, which is what we create in our records. So describing something, what's the title, what's the author, that kind of stuff. There's the structural part of it, and this really has to do with the system stuff, and we're going to look at examples of all of these in a second. And then there's the administrative part of it, which includes rights. Many forms or records of metadata include elements of each of these. However, it is dependent upon the schema, and it's also dependent upon really what you can edit or change, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I will just say when metadata is standardized, it's much more operable and transferable. So that's the other reason to kind of pick a schema and stick with it where you can. So looking at these three basic types of metadata. So, we talked about schema. So what is schema? Schema is your plan or your set of rules with the elements. But what elements go into there? What are your elements? What things do you describe? Well, there are these three basic types of metadata, and they may go into your schema if there's an element for it, or it may be something that completely sits outside what you do in terms of your metadata record. And we're going to talk a little bit, I'll kind of point those out when we're looking at records, and you can kind of hopefully see the difference. But depending on your schema, you may have an element where you can at least include some of this information. The reason why we typically focus down here on descriptive information, this is what would be called our BIB or bibliographic information. You may hear people call cataloging bibliographic description sometimes. That is really what we're focused on because that is the data that we can create that is not easily created by a computer. Now, do systems take whacks at it and try to create descriptive data? Oh yeah, all the time. Anytime you're searching in a system that doesn't have a person actually inputting data there, then it's probably being completely done by the system. Now, if you post something on eBay, if you're going to share something, you're going to sell something on eBay, you're going to add, what's the name of this? What are you selling? So there's a title, right? What are you selling? So there's your title. So what is it? And then you're going to add information, who's selling it. There's your sort of like your creator, your author who's selling it. And then of course you have, when is it going to run? How long is your ad going to last? So there's some dates. And you can even put it into a category and tag it and stuff like that. So, even something like eBay has metadata that's been generated from what the user puts in there. Same thing with Amazon. When a seller is going to sell something in Amazon, or Amazon, has stuff in their warehouse, there's somebody who scans that information in, and if there's not a record already in there, there will be a record that's created. And there is an human intervention in there at some point. So although we're going to talk about descriptive bibliographic data sort of at the end of this, the end of these three, we're going to start with administrative first because I think that's one of the most interesting pieces for us because we do have the opportunity to be able to actually change some of that or add some of that information. And as we are starting to focus more on rights, then that's a spot for that. And then the structural part of it, there's not a lot we can do with that, but we'll talk a little bit about what it is. But the structure is similar to like a table of contents, like how many pages, items, files, the order information, how it's related to other things. We don't typically, even though how many pages can be part of structural metadata, we don't typically input that information because it is usually generated at the system level. So, three types of metadata, and this is a diagram for METS, which is a standard which includes all three types of metadata. So that is a standard that actually includes all the different kinds. So structure, you'd put in information about your pages or your table of contents, whatever. Description would be like your title, your creator. And then administrative metadata would be like what archive does it belong to, who digitized it, things like that. And we'll talk more about that, but I just like this little breakdown because it has all three and it's pretty easy to see them. So administrative metadata. You can think of this as origin metadata and administration of the resource. This is most often created by our system and devices. This can be things like date stamps, file type, stuff like that. It's not always created by the system. Well, it's not always solely created by the system. Let me clarify that, because we do sometimes add to it, or we may even change it. And if you're a person who, goes in and does things with your image metadata, then you may be even changing some of this. But typically, this is created at least first by the systems and devices, and we may or may not edit any of this later. It really refers to the technical information, and that can be like, when and how the file was created, things like that. It does include digital asset management, which is DAM, and this is metadata related to how you manage a resource. Any kind of technical metadata. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of technical metadata as we go. Rights metadata, and this is where digital rights management falls, and we'll talk about that in just a second. What source it came from. There's any metadata that's coming from an external source. Digital provenance, so there are some systems where you can actually trace, like, well, eBay kind of has it. So if you buy something, it shows that you purchased it, and it shows who you purchased it from, right? Same thing with Amazon. If you go back and you look at your purchases, it shows who the vendor was and when you purchased it. That sort of that sort of history of transmission, that sort of history of how it's moved, is that digital provenance. Or, for example, if you order something and you can see the tracking and you follow it, across the country as it gets closer and closer to your house, that is sort of tracing that digital provenance, like what is the path it took to get to you. And then preservation metadata, and we're going to talk more about preservation metadata in a minute. So rights management includes sort of a lot of different things. It includes copyright, so whether or not something's in copyright, access or restrictions, can you access it or not? So this would be where your ability to be able to access it or not, and licensing. So copyright and licensing and access are actually three different things. And if you're doing Dublin Core records, you really should be separating your rights out. So rights, and that's just whether or not it's in copyright and what that copyright is. This is in the public domain. This has no copyright, that kind of thing. There are standard statements you can use for rights, and we'll look at those more later on in this class, but separating out copyright, access, and licensing, because they're different things. So if you say something is copyright, that would be one field, and then how you access it would be another field, and then what the licensing is. This can be used under license of whatever. Digital rights management. This is really one of the things that we probably are the most aware of, because we hit it when, say, your ebook license expires, or maybe you had a trial to something, a trial to an e-resource collection or something like that, a database, and then suddenly it just stops working because your trial expired and you haven't bought it yet. So we encounter digital rights management a lot. Maybe you buy an ebook and it can only be checked out 5 times, or it can only be renewed 2 times. So some of that's baked into the licensing, but the mechanism that controls that is the technological protection measures, the TPM, but that is part of the digital rights management tool set. So DRM, and of course it's kind of become such a frustrating thing to people, because it's, sometimes what we are able to, the licensing of what we buy, has very limited rights in terms of what we can do with it. And, that's not how we've usually bought things in the past. But it's a set of relates to access control. That's what TPM is the access control technologies. And it really does restrict the use of copyrighted works and proprietary hardware. So it has the TPM part of it has to do with the access control, but that digital rights management has to do with managing it as a whole. Preservation metadata. So this is also part of administrative metadata. So kind of pointing out the places where you're most likely to encounter administrative metadata. from a purchasing access standpoint, you're more likely to encounter it in sort of rights management, or if you are cataloging something, creating metadata for something, and you need to create your copyright statement or your license statement, or you need to be able to explain to someone what the access is. This is only available within the building. That would fall under the access management part of rights management. Preservation metadata, this is what's needed to preserve the resource, and this includes information that supports and documents the act of preservation. So how do you preserve it? And this is any contextual information that you might want to include to provide sustainable access. So it's really trying to document what you had before you digitized it. So really looking at those kind of materials, but also born digital content that may be created in a software that might not exist in the future. So if you have a 3D model that was created in AutoCAD or a specific version of AutoCAD, explaining to people in your record what that would be. And there's elements in Dublin Core that you can explain some of this. So examples of preservation metadata: physical medium, including its condition. So if it has deteriorated, or maybe you have digitized something and parts of it were fragmented or parts of it had no sound, you could explain that. The equipment used in the transfer process and its specifications can be really important in terms of figuring out how, why does it sound the way it did, or why does it look the way it did? Any information that might be helpful. Format information, including digital resolution. You can even include staff involved in the process, like who digitized this, if you think that might be of help. There's also a digital signature, and this is primarily would be for maybe for documents you need someone to sign off on. Maybe if it's like faculty papers and you are having the faculty sign off their rights, then you might add a digital signature that would say like, this is okay. Really anything relevant. And this can be, the preservation metadata can be as elaborate or as simple as you want it to be. There's a long list here, and there's much more you can add besides this. There is actually a preservation metadata schema that you could include with your record. So you could do Dublin Core for the description, and then you could use preservation, the premise, for the preservation aspect of it. You could do that. Or you could, since we're just really focused on kind of Dublin Core for this part of it, you could just focus, add this in your Dublin Core elements. And we're going to look more at elements, and in week 3, we're really just kind of setting the foundation for our metadata work here. So here's an example, and we're going to look at lots of examples as we go along. We've kind of got through the terminology aspect of it. So we have this little gray section here. They've coded all the gray stuff as descriptive metadata. So you have here object, but the object is what would be the title, right? The Turkish room in the clubhouse, they called it object, but we could also call it title, or we could call it item, whatever we want to call it. They called it object. A description, so there's the description of what it is. Some additional information, a comment, which would be equivalent to a note and a mark record. Date, what the date of this is. Location, and it actually links to some other things, and then what country this was from. And then when you come down here, you'll see there's a little bit of a mix. They actually put their creator down here in this section. So here's the photographer. Creator would be part of the descriptive metadata, so it could go up here. So that's the thing too. Once you get your metadata in place, then how it's displayed, it can pull from different schemas, or it can even be in different order. So it could be that your order on your form in terms of the fields does not match this, but the display can make it whatever. So we have at the top, this is all of our descriptive sort of bibliographic data. Like if we were cataloging, this is the sort of information we'd include. And then when we come down here, we have things like type, dimensions, format, and technique. That's actually falls under technical metadata because it's about the item in terms of its technical aspects. But of course, if you catalog and mark records, you put that sort of thing in your 336, 337, 338 field, and there's some other 300 field. There's some other places where you put that information too. So, you know, there are some equivalents in terms of how things go. And then they have a whole lot of keywords. So, whole lot of keywords. And they have some structural metadata. So the archive and where it comes from is, you know, what it's part of is part of that structural metadata. So structural metadata, I talked a little bit about this earlier, defines the relationships between the whole and parts, can be used for navigational purposes. Things that are structural could include links to related files. It could be links to its collection, as we see in our example here. Can be pages in a book, things like that, but it's really about that structural aspect. So if we were to look at sort of a diagram, we'll look at this a couple of times. We have our bibliographic record 1 and 2 up here. So that would be descriptive metadata and some technical metadata. Maybe if we put copyright information in there, which most bibliographic records have, then we have a little bit of administrative metadata in there. And then the structural metadata would be the relationships between these subrecords, and would also be things like where the files are located, the folder path, things like that. If we have you know, this is our these records are in our ILS, that location would be part of that structural metadata. So some more examples of structural metadata. You have a table of contents, your URL with your file name, and each, when you have a URL, each slash is a new folder on the server, and it's hierarchical. So Georgia Web Girl is one of my websites. I have a knowledge base. Within that knowledge base, I have a category. Within that category, I have one for workshops. It's a hierarchy. So that path through those folders, so that path, the URL path, is a form of structural metadata. Descriptive metadata, this is really what we probably are all most familiar with. This is what we think of in traditional cataloging. It's the majority of our bibliographic record. Describes a resource for the purposes such as discovery and identification, includes elements such as title, abstract author keywords. Keywords can include tags, which would be uncontrolled, you know, they're just whatever you put in, or it can include a controlled vocabulary, meaning you pick off the list, such as the Library of Congress subject headings. Keywords is probably one of the most used terms on the web, and its meaning is context-based, so it has to do with who's talking about keywords and what they mean. Of course, MARC, this is the metadata generated by catalogers within a MARC, which is machine readable cataloging. Bibliographic record is primarily considered to be descriptive metadata. There's a few places where it's not, and we'll talk about those, but for the most part, it's descriptive. Provides information about the title from the item from its title and creator to its format to the appropriate Library of Congress subject heading or Sears or whatever controlled vocabulary you're using as assigned by the cataloger. Bibliographic record, description of resource, that is the true nature of descriptive metadata. So let's look at some common examples of metadata, and then we're going to look at some less common, or not less common, but things we maybe don't look at as much. So bibliographic record. Primarily descriptive, but there are some administrative aspects. So, you know, things like our system number up here. I know it's hard to read this, but things up here like our bib system number. That's generated by the system. That's going to be administrative. Of course, we have a little bit of information here. We have a copyright date. So there's a little bit of administrative metadata. We don't have anything about rights or licensing or anything like that. We don't have anything about, you know, archiving this or anything like that. We do have a 500 note here that these are papers presented at a conference. So that traces the provenance a little bit. So a little bit, maybe a little bit of administrative metadata there. That's probably a little bit of unintentional metadata. There are other places in a MARC record to trace provenance. And so if we had those fields, then that would be a little bit more administrative metadata. And then of course we have a little bit of technical metadata with our 300 note that tells us that there's 622 pages and there's 24 centimeters. This is missing, this is a AACR2 record, so it's missing fields that have a little bit more technical information, but a little bit of technical information, a little smattering of administrative information in here, primarily descriptive information. Dublin Core record, same sort of thing, primarily descriptive metadata. We have a little bit of information down here. We have the Europeana provider, the VIR Central Public Library, so that's a little bit of administrative metadata there. And if it links out to a resource, this one doesn't, but if it actually linked out to a resource there, then that would be tracing that structural metadata a little bit. And then of course up here at the top we have the date stamp, which tells us when it was created. We have an identifier for it that's unique, so that's a little bit of administrative and structural metadata there. Another example, this is from the Civil Rights Digital Library. It's been redesigned, but this is a nice screenshot. Descriptive metadata, pretty easy to kind of see where that falls. And then sort of descriptive is up here at the top. We do have a little bit of technical metadata with that sound recordings, just not much, but just a little bit there. And then we have that information down here at the bottom about rights and usage, and that would be some administrative metadata. So I just kind of pointed out what was sort of the bulk of a record. So I mentioned mapping. You probably noticed in my little diagram it said and mappings. Mapping is what makes all of this happen. So if we want to get stuff, if we want to harvest records, we want to go out and get records and harvest them and ingest them, put them in our system, we're going to have to figure out how our fields are going to match up if they're not the same schema. And even if they are the same schema, you know, my institutional repository may choose different elements than yours does, and so we'll need to account for that differences. So something called mapping is sort of part of the process of getting records from one database to another. So crosswalking them, ingesting, harvesting, and data mapping is that process of matching fields from one database to another. So in terms of how we think of things in sort of metadata terminology, mapping is just looking at your records and kind of trying to figure out how they're going to go from one system to another. Data mapping is actually that process of sitting down and looking at the elements and making sure that they match up. Mapping and data mapping are sort of interchangeable for us in the metadata world. A lot of us just say mapping, but when you go out into the larger data world, you'll see people using the term data mapping. They're really interchangeable in that way. A data map describes how each field will match to fields in a different database. And we're going to look at that example again and just talk about it just a little bit more. Upon ingest, so once you go out and you get your records, or maybe you've uploaded your records, so you didn't ingest them, you didn't go get them from somebody, or you didn't go out and harvest them so that you could ingest them, but you had records that were uploaded. So upon ingesting those records, if you have different schemas, you'll need to figure out which fields you're going to map or which fields you're going to bring over to your new database. And then if they do not have the same field names, so for example, we saw object and in that one database instead of title. So if they call it object and that's what they're using, and their schema does not use Dublin Core, so it said object, then we would need to map or say object is equal to title in our Dublin Core repository. Mapping will not be successful. Mapping will not be successful with interoperable and that's opposite. Mapping will be successful with interoperable and transferable metadata. So it must be ready to kind of go in order for it to work. I'll have to fix that. So it looks something like this. This is just sort of a diagram where you have artist, author, title, object, and we're going to say like, how is it going to go to those fields? So just sort of give you a little visual of that. In terms of, remember the application profile we looked at earlier, and I said it had mapping stuff. So we have usage, all of that stuff we talked about on the left side, that was part of the application profile part of it. So we're not really looking at that part of it again. What we are looking at though is what we are calling our field. So you see here I have a field called affiliation. So we call it in my repository affiliation, but it maps to the Dublin Core contributor field. So if I were to bring these records into an institutional repository that was not mine, and it saw affiliation, or it saw the label as affiliation, the backend actually says contributor. So that just tells anybody who's looking at the back end of it, it says affiliation when you're looking at the public, but when you go to the back end, it's going to be contributor. So we would know that taking that, what looks to be affiliation on the front end, actually is contributor on the back end, and we're going to map it over to the 710 field in a MARC record. So that is where my mapping happens. When I go to take these records over to a MARC ILS, I'll either have to change those records from Dublin Core into MARC and then change my fields if they do not happen. Now you can do this through various software. There's OpenRefine, there's MarcEdit, things like that that will actually change records. Some ILSs will actually do that work for you too. So that's the plan for this. So application profile is sort of the plan, it's sort of how we apply what our process is, our instructions, but then on the right side of it, it's actually a mapping document where it's like map from Dublin Core to this MARC field. Here's an example of how that works in action. So this is a work form. You know, it's just like a website you go to, actually a student goes to, and they just fill in information. And their interface is actually a much simpler than this one. This is sort of the second step of it. So student fills in their information, comes over to the CAD logger. CAD logger sees this interface with information filled in. CAD logger does more work, you know, and you can see here there's some information about what it corresponds to in case there's a couple of places where it's like MARC field so that they would know exactly which MARC fields they were filling out. Once the CAD logger does that, this is not a MARC record. It's preparing Dublin Core for a Dublin Core record that came out of a form from a student, preparing it into a MARC record. So once that happens, the CAD logger has done his or her work at that point, then it actually creates a MARC record, which can, or creates a record that looks like a MARC record, and it can be downloaded at that point and put into an institutional repository, or it can be automatically as a group kind of collected, harvested, and then ingested. It can also be converted back to Dublin Core if it needs to as a more full record for the institutional repository. And that makes a very nice looking MARC record. This is AACR2, so it is an older MARC record, but this is when I actually took the time to snapshot all of these. So metadata in the wild, we're going to finish up here by looking at some metadata kind of out on the net. You know, we can do all kinds of metadata things. We can rate things, we can tag things, we can @ someone to create those links between whatever we're doing in them. We can add keywords. Sometimes we can even add control vocabulary. We can assign or flag for appropriate audience level. We can define genre. We can do so much. Primarily what we're doing in terms of when we're out on the larger web is descriptive metadata. However, there are sites that are beginning to allow and encourage right statements. You primarily see this in like video or image, social media, YouTube, Flickr, things like that. You don't see it as much in other social media, but a little bit of that. We did talk earlier about how our software and devices can create metadata, and I was going to show you one example. So for example, images, our devices create something called EXIF, which is embedded metadata, and it's actually like it's in the back end. So if you actually can break into an image, or you have software that will allow you to see this part of it, then you can actually look at that image, look at that information. And that information includes GPS related information, the location, if you have location turned on. It includes the date, the file format, it includes the file name, the camera make, sometimes file size, and more. And we're going to look at what that looks like in just a second. But that is administrative instructional metadata that is only created by the device. So this is one of the things, like if you you have location turned on your phone and you have allowed Instagram to use your location, it is pulling that information from this embedded metadata that you can't see unless you've actually have the software that can do that. So you can see here, this was from my camera a long time ago, but you can see it just really pulled everything. It even gives the dots per inch. It gives the aperture value that I used, my metering mode, that I didn't use a flash. I mean, it's just really amazing what kind of information the camera will provide in terms of metadata. Now, not all cameras go this deep. Really just depends upon the camera, but that's just an example of some metadata out in the wild. Of course, web designers still sometimes use it, still. There are attempts every few years, it seems like, to do something better with metadata. And you may have heard the term SEO, search engine optimization, and it's like kind of a big deal and people get paid lots of money and stuff. And basically all that is trying to get on the top of the search results at Google. Sometimes people, of course, you can pay and do ads and stuff like that, and that'll push your results up higher. But you can also do something called SEO, where you're trying to figure out like what the magic formula is to get to the front page of Google. Same sort of thing with Facebook. People try to figure out like what's the magic formula to get more eyeballs, because the more eyeballs you get, the more money you make, that kind of thing. If you're using Google Ads, you make more money if you get more people to see it. So that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of attempts through the years to figure out like how the best way to do this is. Google changes because of course people try to exploit it. There's sort of SEO for good, and then sort of black hat, which is SEO for bad. You're trying to really exploit it and use it incorrectly and things like that. There's been attempts over the years to try to do that, and then Google changes what they're doing. But one of the early attempts was to really use, to try to use what libraries were doing with metadata, and in terms of, describing websites. And so this is an example just pulled from a website, but this was an example of sort of like how you could use what they called meta tags. So how you could use Dublin core, and you see there the DC, that means it's Dublin core. You could use DC or Dublin core within a website. And so this is, of course, on the back end of the website embedded in the code. And there were a lot of attempts to do this. And in the early days, Dublin core was very popular, and there were a lot of attempts to try to do this, but it really never caught on. For one thing, people started abusing this. So you see here the keywords. People did what they called keyword stuffing. So they would just put every single keyword they could possibly think in there, and they would put a gazillion of them in the thought that Google would see all those keywords, and for every keyword that was put in there, Google would show their website as a potential search. And it was pretty successful in the early days of the web. So there was a lot of what they call keyword stuffing, and people would put hundreds and hundreds of keywords, sometimes related to what their website was and sometimes not. And then Google, of course, said no more, and they stopped searching, they stopped indexing those keywords entirely. They keep it very secretive in terms of what they change, and some people say they do index keywords some now and not so much, but they really are better able, is that their technology has gotten better. And I'm not picking on Google, I just know more about what Google does than Bing and the others. But in terms of Google, they've gotten a lot better in terms of being able to sort of analyze the website as a whole, in terms of not only what the content itself is, but also how long the website has existed, you know, how authoritative the author is, how popular the website is, how many people link to it, all kinds of things. So more recently, in the last few years, there has been a group that got together, and this was Google, Bing, and Yahoo, and they have created their own schema for markup. So their own schema for how to do metadata for websites. And you see here that it looks a little different than what we might say. So for example, we have, you know, item prop, and then we have author. So that item property, and then we have author. So it's a little bit different in terms of how they include information, and the names are not inverted, so it's not like Faye, Robin M, as it would be an authority record. This is called structured data, so if you go out into the sort of semantic web or web world, you'll see more discussion of structured data for websites. They're really talking a lot about this kind of thing and using schema.org. I would say it's been marginally successful. It is used by some web designers, but you know, much as the early days of Dublin Core and trying to use Dublin Core in websites, schema.org has really not been embraced by a lot of people. I think there's more interest in the library community and the archives community in terms of maybe using this for our websites than there has been sort of in the larger commercial community. But it is an interesting project. I mentioned there were other places that we see metadata that we may not think about, and Microsoft Office, of course, embeds the metadata. And one of the things I always find quite fun is that if you share a document, and let's say, you know, you reuse it and things like that, there used to be a document that there were a couple of us that sort of co-edited off and on, and one of my colleagues started it, and then she went off and left, and, you know, we still worked on it, and a bunch of us edited it. But even if you saved it, whoever saved it, the author was still this person that had not worked in this library for 5 years, probably. So this is one of the things Microsoft did add, was the ability to remove properties and personal information. But the only thing is, it removes everything. So you can't just say like, you know, we want to keep the revision number, but we want to remove the other information. It's not very granular. It's kind of remove it all or keep it all. So that can be a little bit of a kind of like not as granular as we would probably like. But you do see examples of information that it keeps, including descriptive information. So it did not pull the title here, but it will sometimes pull the title. You can add the subject. It has tags. Of course, there's the author, so the origin. Remember, we were talking about origin metadata. The origin metadata includes both preservation, some preservation information. So we have here the revision number. We don't use version control for this, so we didn't have a version number, but it did keep the revision number, how many times this particular document was revised, and then also the program name. So a little bit of preservation information in terms of the software and the version number. And then, of course, we have some administrative metadata here in terms of the date that was created and in terms of the date that it was saved. And you'll see that it was last printed on 2113, which who knows where that came from, because that's not right. Flickr used to also do really great stuff in terms of administrative, descriptive, instructional metadata. It's not quite so easy to see that information anymore, but just another example of how metadata might appear in the wild. This was a little graphic I came up with to explain MP3s in terms of how metadata exists for there. So your song number and order is structural, and the title, album name, genre, artist information is all descriptive, but the relationship of which song is part of which album is structural. And then of course you have that digital rights management, which is administrative, and you really can't see that in your player, except it just may say song is skipped, or you do not have the license to play this, or log in to get your license, or something like that, but it's all from that information. So wrapping up here, sort of concerns and thoughts, metadata is for good and bad. Much of the current discussion about metadata, tagging, keywords, controlling headings versus non-controlling headings in OCLC centers upon potential differences in the quality of user-generated metadata. And OCLC has recently made a decision about how they're going to sort of what levels of records you can have in OCLC now if you're creating records in OCLC. And so it used to be there were many different levels of records, from a very skeletal record to a very high level record from somebody from the Library of Congress. And they've really just sort of abandoned that entirely. So there's still sort of a higher level record, but anybody can create them. And there's no real threshold for, well, there is a threshold, but there's no checking of that threshold. And then there's sort of all other records. So, again, it's this discussion we have kind of ongoing about the quality versus quantity of metadata. Of course, as with any user group, and that includes us, there are various levels of expertise and understanding of metadata. And my biggest advice to you is just to be a good data steward. So as you go forward, think about interoperability, think about transferability, think about how your elements are going to be broken down. If you need to use a second metadata schema to really be able to address your resource, consider that and how that's going to work out. So consider that. Think about your quality versus quantity. This has been an ongoing discussion my entire career. Is it better to have more? More data is better than no data. You can't search what's not there. Then there's the garbage in, garbage out, meaning if you have bad metadata, you're going to get bad results. It's just one of those things where there's so much research that shows both sides of it. Certainly, if you can't find what's not there. So my suggestion would be, in terms of quality versus quantity, I've always said try to go for the most quality you can while achieving the most quantity that's possible. And I know that seems like, well, you can't do both at the same time, but there is that sort of sweet spot where you're able to use your systems, or you're able to use tools to help do some work so that you can keep your quantity up. So how to create better metadata. Follow the schema. So when you choose a schema, follow it. If you can choose a schema, so if you're starting something new and you're like, wow, I can choose any schema I want, think about the resources that you currently have, as well as the resources that you will be collecting in the future in that repository, and try to make the best decision you can on that. You can't know everything, but sort of give yourself a little growth. If you know that you're collecting resources for an institutional repository of scholarly materials, and you see that your faculty are going around with their phone cameras and they're videotaping everything, then maybe you need to think about talking to them about their video production, and then also how you're going to support that in the institutional repository, if that would be a place that those things would end up. Use tools and software. There's lots of tools and software, and we'll just talk a little bit about them throughout this class, but we won't be focusing specifically on tools and software you can use for a metadata cleanup or to enhance it to make it better. But there are things that you can do out there. You can consider when you're working on metadata, especially legacy metadata that's old and might be skeletal, you can consider kind of cleaning it up and enriching the records too. There's something called real world objects, or RWOS, which is linking to supplemental resources outside of a library's holding or linking to authoritative resources like Wikidata and things like that. And I'll share some resources about that sort of as a future thought for metadata. We are starting to see this concept of linking to data versus typing it in becoming more prominent in library data, and we're starting to see this in MARC records. So linked data is about using the web to connect related data that wasn't previously linked to, or using the web to lower the barriers to linking data. Basically, it just means you link to the data instead of typing it in. So that certainly would make keeping up with records a lot easier because we wouldn't have to change that information. And we're talking about linking to authoritative resources where the link isn't going to be changing every week. So we can do this in Dublin Core records easily already, and we're starting to use this in MARC records as well. And we use the subfield 0 and 1 for that. So just to show you what that looks like in a MARC field example. So this is sort of one of these things that is a very evolving scenario right now, where we're really starting to look at how we can use linked data and possibly at some point eliminate some of the text that we type in. So for example, at some point, instead of typing in Santa Claus, we could just use the link to Santa Claus. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, Santa Claus' name is probably never going to change, but let's say Santa Claus, the Santa Claus name did change. And at that point, if we just had text typed in, of course, we'd have to go in and fix it. Whereas if we had a link that was linking to this record, we would never have to fix that. So to wrap up, while MARC data still has a place in the bibliographic world, we're starting to look at moving out of MARC to more semantic web friendly formats. So that would be things that would be more friendly to the Internet of Things environment we live in. Dublin Core and other metadata schemas, which we'll be looking at in the upcoming weeks, are natively more compatible with the larger digital world. And Dublin Core and other schemas can be expressed in XML, which is what we're going to talk about for next week. MARC can also easily be converted into XML, and then once it's in XML, it can be converted into different markups, which gives us interoperability and transferability. So if you're looking to migrate from ILS to a different ILS, you're probably going to take, or they're going to take your records and MARC XML, or maybe even XML itself, and then they're going to put them into your new ILS. That's one of the easiest ways to do it. So we're really starting to kind of think about how we can make records more interoperable as a whole, and we're starting to look at how we can reduce data entry through using linked data. So we'll focus on XML next week, and we're going to get kind of codey, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. Don't forget to participate in the class discussion. Take the quiz when you're ready, but within the first 2 weeks of class. And on that note, thank you, and I'll see you in our class space.